Hey YouTube land, this is Shalika here with I Am Still Mom. I would like to thank you guys already for your views of my lost stories from the previous two videos. And today, as a continuation of my lost story, we're going to talk about incompetent cervix. Basically, with my definitely with the loss of my second son, incompetent cervix came into play once the doctors evaluated, my pregnancy and things that happened. So to give you a little bit of background, to kind of set the scene a little bit, incompetent cervix or cervix insufficiency is where somewhere between, you could say 14 to 20 some odd weeks, your cervix, the tissue of your cervix is weak and it begins to dilate early, causing preterm labor or preterm birth for a pregnancy that otherwise would have been healthy. With my second son, based on, my cervix opening early, my bags coming out early, and no other issues that would have caused my cervix to dilate too early, my doctor believed that it was due to an incompetent cervix or weakened cervix or cervical insufficiency. So, unfortunately, with cervical insufficiency, they usually don't catch that until you have one or more pregnancies that end in that way. With my first son, being that, everything happened so fast and it happened at home, and I was also working with a different OB, there wasn't a lot of data to conclude that cervical insufficiency could have been an option. I do remember having it in the back of my mind once, I told you from the last video, I went to my follow-up and they couldn't tell me anything that was wrong with the baby per se. So I had that in the back of my mind, but first pregnancy, first loss, it just wasn't a question that, I raised. I just kept it as a mental note. So when I went into my second pregnancy and they began to, my new OB began to check my cervix at 16 weeks, if I was connecting the dots, or if I could have connected the dots, I could have realized that that might have been the angle that they were trying to go into and maybe would have been more careful. Hindsight 2020, this is what I say. Going back 3 years, I don't know what I would have done. But basically, so let's say after, I had Aiden and I was sent home, the uniqueness about this particular situation is I worked with one OB office, but because of the events surrounding my loss, I ended up at the main office, the main hospital, where, my doctor wasn't, he didn't practice at the main facility. He practiced at the facility that I was prior to. So based on that, based on the things that happened with, me delivering Aiden early, they had me go in and follow up with maternal fetal medicine. Basically, maternal fetal medicine are the doctors that handle high risk pregnancies. Usually, it's either high risk for other reasons or high risk based on, your age. And I say that because the age for high risk pregnancy starts at 35. I was only 32 when I lost Aiden, but because of my circumstances, my pregnancy was considered high risk after the fact. So I met with them. It was about, I would say it was about 2 weeks, maybe 2.5, 3 weeks after my loss. And what was crazy about that visit is, you go to the doctor, the standard procedure is they give you a pregnancy test. And me being one of those people who, research all that, research, and I look at my aftercare instructions, I saw that on that visit, my pregnancy test was still positive. So though I had had a miscarriage, there was still some HCG, the hormone that they detect in pregnancy. There was still enough of it left for it to read on a pregnancy test. Now imagine me seeing that and pretty much losing my marbles, because with me being a little bit further along, my hormones were a little bit, I don't know if it was more intense or they were more developed. I'm not quite sure how to word it, but however, still dealt with my hormones trying to regulate themselves. And in that regulation, I still had a positive pregnancy test, even though I was no longer pregnant. So when I met with maternal fetal medicine, they had some notes from my first pregnancy, because the thing about the hospital systems here in North Carolina, or at least in the Triangle area, a lot of them are connected. So even if you go from one system to another, if you're in some type of patient portal where they can, easily talk to one another, your information can be transferred. So she had enough of my information to know that I had a loss in my previous pregnancy. But as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't a whole lot of data. So all she could go off of, or all she could talk to me about, was, the most recent pregnancy. And based on what had happened in the hospital or before the hospital, from my bags coming out of my cervix, from my cervix dilating, and the baby ending up in the birth canal, she basically came to the conclusion that it was an incompetent cervix, and that the next course of action, aside from putting me on birth control and letting me heal before I tried again, the next course of action was to give me a cerclage. And the cerclage would happen with the next pregnancy. Any subsequent pregnancy, I would have a cerclage. And basically what that means is they go in and they sew your cervix up so that it stays closed as long as they can keep it closed. Some people go on, get cerclages, and make it to 40 weeks. A lot of people don't, but they make it far enough to have a viable live birth. So we were having that discussion, and from her notes, her recommendation was that, I would go on birth control for a little while. I would get off. I would try to get pregnant again. And then around 15 weeks, she would give me the cerclage to sew up my cervix, and that I would be on bed rest for the remainder of my pregnancy. Now, from my first video, you guys know I lost my first son at 14 weeks, and nobody really could tell me why. So although a cerclage at 15 weeks seemed ideal, in my mind, I wasn't quite settled with that. What I decided to do, and something I always recommend with any woman with questions about their maternal health and getting pregnant and all that, I decided to go back to the OB that I had pretty much been working with for the duration of my pregnancy until things went left. So what I did was I went back to my regular OB's office probably about a week later, and the OB that I spoke to was not the same OB that I had been working with, but he was in the same practice. And when I talked to him, I loved it because he had a plan. And his plan considered both pregnancies, even though there wasn't a lot of detail surrounding the first one. It was enough detail for him to say, okay, I also agree that you have an incompetent cervix, and what my plan is to bring you in around 12 to 13 weeks. Let me back up. Around 12 weeks, we would do genetic testing. Around 12 to 13 weeks, we would, once the tests came back, we would go with a cerclage. I would have that cerclage, and I would either be on bed rest for the duration of the pregnancy, or there would be some combination of the cerclage and progesterone suppositories. Forgive me for screwing it up, my braces. And what the progesterone does is it helps you, it helps you stay pregnant longer as long as nothing's wrong. It helps to, I don't know if it strengthens the cervix, but it just helps keep everything together. And so with that plan, what my husband and I needed to be aware of is as soon as we got pregnant, we would have to stop having sex, nothing in the vagina, until I had the baby. Which, for sexually active couples, that might be hard, but when you've lost 2 babies, it's a sacrifice worth taking. He was very confident in his observations. And I felt like, okay, I have a little peace with this, whenever we do decide to get pregnant again, it's a possibility. I felt like it was more of a possibility that this pregnancy would last. So, to this day, we're still kind of running with that plan in mind. We haven't gotten pregnant, for many reasons. For a couple years, we didn't even try, and that's another video. And we have decided to start trying, but that's also another topic for a different video that you guys should stay tuned for. With that being said, I just wanted to bring up the conversation of incompetent cervix. You may have heard of it before, you may have not, and you may have more questions. Feel free to leave comments down below in the comment section, and just let me know your thoughts. Maybe you know someone who's gone through this. Maybe you're curious about what questions to ask if you're ever faced with this. As I mentioned earlier, kind of going back to what incompetent cervix is, it's when your cervix opens too early due to weakened tissues in the cervix, which causes you to dilate, which in turn causes you to prematurely deliver an otherwise healthy baby. It usually happens to people between weeks, I would say 15 to 20 or more. And it's something that is diagnosable, but they usually don't catch it until it has happened to you a couple times. I have a family member that unfortunately she had it happen to her at least 3 times before they caught it. So the gift in mine is I only had to go through it twice before, there was a plan in place and that I felt comfortable with. The other thing that you should know about incompetent cervix cases is they happen in 7 to 10% of pregnancies. Again, as I said in the earlier videos, I really hate statistics, but for the sake of information, I felt like I should share it here. So, yeah. And what they do to resolve it is either a combination of a cerclage and progesterone, or just a cerclage and bed rest. Before I go, there's 2 types of cerclages. There's the transvaginal, which is usually the first one that they go with. And then the second one is transabdominal. Basically, a woman who has 2 or more pregnancies that she loses due to a weakened cervix, their first course of action is a transvaginal cerclage. If she has an issue where something happens with the transvaginal cerclage and it cannot be, she has another loss, and it's determined that, sewing up the bottom of the cervix, because the cervix is like a tiny tube that sits at the bottom of your uterus. In the transvaginal, they're focusing on the bottom of, and it's not tube, I would say funnel. They're focusing on the bottom of the funnel, and they sew that up. If there's complications with that, should she have another subsequent pregnancy, then doctors are likely to recommend the transabdominal cerclage. And what happens in that cerclage is, before you even get pregnant, they go in and they sew up your cervix at the top. So they, I believe the incision is similar to what they give you when you have a C-section. They go in and they sew up the top of the cervix. After you heal, you get pregnant, and you go on to have the baby. The only thing with the transabdominal is, if you have a transabdominal cerclage, you are automatically a candidate for a cesarean or a C-section, because they actually, they sew the top of your cervix up, so they actually, you can't deliver naturally, and there's no way for them to go in there and remove the stitch until they pretty much cut you up and have the baby. So that's my video on incompetent cervix, insufficient cervix, weakened cervix as it's sometimes called, and my story as it relates to that. Again, leave a comment, subscribe, share with other grieving parents and grandparents, and I hope you all have a good night. You may get one more video before the 4th, but if not, I hope you guys have a happy 4th of July. Bye.